He took his first vacation, returning to Europe to crowds that were beyond his wildest dreams. In a bittersweet moment, he learns of Hetty Kelly's death from her brother while in London. More cheerfully, he begins several friendships in London that become lifelong, including with the famous writer H.G. Wells. In addition, he and Sydney brought their mother, Hannah, to the States, where she lived the rest of her life, under the best medical care that Charlie's money could provide. Returning to America, and to his work, Charlie quickly produces his next film, The Idol Class. Charlie begins working on his next film, Payday, in his professional life, and meets the European actress Pola Negri, with whom he has an off-again, on-again romantic relationship that goes on for nearly a year. Over the course of that year, Charlie Chaplin releases his next film, The Pilgrim, about an escaped convict who takes on the role of a preacher to avoid recapture, and prepares for his first dramatic film, A Woman of Paris, designed to catapult Edna Purviance into her own career. Audiences by now had associated the name Charlie Chaplin with comedy, however, and were not expecting serious fare. Although a good movie, it died at the box office and gave Charlie Chaplin his first commercial failure. Charlie Chaplin in the Gold Rush, and in a family way that was reversed by his next film, one of the classics of the silent era, The Gold Rush. It is the story of the little tramp going north to the Alaskan gold rush, and by more luck than skill both getting the girl and becoming rich. It is touching, poignant, and hilarious, containing some of Chaplin's most famous routines. However, early in the filming of the movie, Chaplin's leading lady, Leda Gray, had to be replaced by Georgia Hale since Charlie Chaplin had married Leda Gray, and she had become pregnant. She was only 16 at the time. Chaplin, worried incessantly about his young wife's pregnancy, had felt that the death of his first son was, in some way, his fault. Thankfully, in 1925 this child was born healthy. Charles Spencer Chaplin Jr. Charlie had qualms about naming the child after himself, fearing that the boy would live in his father's shadow, but he gave way to Leda. That same year, The Gold Rush, Read Review, was released to critical acclaim and great financial success. Some believe it is Chaplin's finest film. Ironically, there was the third birth that year that would become integral to Chaplin. Years later, Una O'Neill was born. The next year, Charlie began work on his next film, The Circus, Read Review. As John McCabe noted in his excellent biography of Charlie Chaplin, The Circus was not the equal of The Gold Rush, but was a good film in its own right, and, given the circumstances under which it was filmed, it was a miracle that it was even palatable. Charlie Chaplin in a messy divorce despite the birth of a second son, Sydney. In 1926, Charlie and Leda's marriage broke apart bitterly, and publicly. Charges went back and forth, with newspapers gleefully displaying the details of the Chaplins' marital woes. Charlie Chaplin always refused to discuss his marriage with Leda. Leda, however, wrote a one-side account, wife of the life of the party. The divorce ended in 1927 with a record-breaking divorce settlement of $825,000. The stress was enough to permanently turn Charlie Chaplin's hair prematurely white. During all of this, Charlie continued to film The Circus, Read Review, one of his lesser-known, but best, films. Charlie Chaplin The Gold Rush by from Art.com 6. In 1928, Charlie Chaplin released The Circus to popular acclaim, and also received a special Oscar for his work on the film as director, actor, producer. Sadly, this positive year was also crushingly negative, as Charlie's beloved mother died. Chaplin's life continued to be centered around his work, even in his grief, as he began work on his next film towards the end of that year, City Lights, Read Review. Charlie Chaplin The End of the Tramp. City Lights, released in 1931, was Charlie Chaplin's first non-silent film. But it still was not a talking picture. Chaplin included the musical soundtrack and used sound effects, but nobody spoke in the picture yet. This was a major gamble for Chaplin since sound pictures had now become the standard. But it was a gamble that paid off handsomely. The movie was both a financial and critical success, and many believe it to be one of Chaplin's finest films, if not his best. After City Lights, Charlie Chaplin did something totally out of character. He took a vacation. Actually, Chaplin took vacations quite frequently, both to refresh himself and to find new ideas for his films. But this was his first extended vacation, away from creating a new movie for nearly 2 years. He talks at length about this time in his autobiography, My Autobiography, including globetrotting and how he was nearly assassinated in Japan, but perhaps his most pivotal moment was in 1932 when he met Paulette Goddard, who would co-star in his next film Modern Times, which would be the Tramp's final film. After the release of Modern Times, Charlie Chaplin and Paulette Goddard were married in secret, while on vacation in the Orient. Upon his return, Charlie began his most audacious comedy yet, The Great Dictator, making fun of Adolf Hitler himself. Hitler, in many ways, was a natural subject for Chaplin to satirize. Hitler, it is said, adopted his mustache in imitation of Charlie. Both were smaller men, of slight build. And Chaplin saw the ideas that Hitler was championing as horrible, evil, and Charlie was determined to show the world what he saw. Modern Times Charlie Chaplin Attacks Hitler in The Great Dictator was Charlie Chaplin's first true talking picture, and when it was finally released in 1940, it was a worldwide sensation. Many people mistakenly think that the character of the Jewish barber in the film is the tramp, but Charlie Chaplin was adamant that they are different characters. Although the barber uses many of the tramp's mannerisms, he is also clearly an individual in his own right. And the barber is far more long-winded, as the famous "Look Up, Hannah" speech at the end of the movie reminds us. Charlie Chaplin Un-American? In the same year that Charlie Chaplin began working on The Great Dictator, the House Un-American Committee begins investigating Charlie. At first glance, there seems to be no reason for this until the second glance. Earlier, Chaplin had done his patriotic part in raising money for the war effort, alongside his longtime friends Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford, raising large amounts of money for the war. Charlie was a lifelong pacifist, but he was also a realist who saw that the aggression of the Axis powers had to be stopped. In many ways, Chaplin was politically naive, such as speaking at fundraisers for the communist USSR, whom Chaplin simply saw as our allies in the fight. And by suggesting that America immediately open a two-front war to help our friends in the Soviet Union.